Welcome to the latest in my Bootcamp for Saints video series, where I work through each section of the Gospel of Mark as it tracks the signs of the zodiac. This is Sagittarius for 2019. If you'd like to hang out past my treatment of the Sagittarius section, I'd like to walk you through a couple of issues that I've been dealing with ever since I started this series. First, I've been proceeding on the assumption that the Gospel of Mark was written first, and most scholars agree with that. But that doesn't mean they're right. And as a matter of fact, a lot of the evidence that decades ago seemed slam dunk in favor of that precedence can also be used to support the theory that Matthew was written first, which is the traditional order. Now, the problem with the whole argument is nobody seems to have paid attention to the Gospel and the Zodiac by the Reverend Bill Darlison. That's basically the textbook for this series. Does it have any bearing on that argument? Actually, it does, in at least two critical areas. It doesn't solve the riddle. It does answer some of the questions, and help give us a firmer grip on critical background material. And as another matter of fact, the evidence they discuss, and all this will be talked about very briefly, dramatically supports my position that Mark chose to organize his gospel around the signs of the zodiac because he'd been collaborating with Mithraists in the Roman army. Second, I'm going to bring in a little help. A non-Christian Harvard scholar who gave a very charming series of lectures back in the 1970s on literary hermeneutics. That's the study of interpreting literature. And he happened to use the Gospel of Mark as a source for his critiques. Now, I bring him in because, and let me be honest here, I'm kind of freaking out. I'm praying hard every day. I'm bringing this to Jesus because I'm teaching that Jesus married another man. In fact, and not in spirit, that they had a wedding night and everything that entails. So I'm working double and triple overtime to make sure I nail down all that details. But nevertheless, I wonder, am I full of crap? Am I a know-it-all? Is this wishful thinking because I'm gay? Well, there's a healthy dose of the first two, but not enough to make a difference. Every treatment I'm putting these biblical passages through, as you'll see, or as I try to show, is 100% legitimate. Now, the third is the opposite of true. I would be wishfully thinking if I avoided the very discussion that I'm having here. And thus we move forward. And I reiterate here in Sagittarius what I said in Scorpio and Libra, that every time I look at this case, I try to prove that it's wrong. And I always end up making it stronger than ever. And this is not going to be an exception. So now let's read our Bible. In the Sagittarius section, we begin the final stages of Jesus' ministry. And he's coming into Jerusalem. There he will have an explosive encounter with the powers that be at the temple, which, as you will see, is fitting for Sagittarius. Sagittarius is the third sign of the fire triplicity, and it shares the ardor and passion of Aries and Leo, the fire signs which preceded in the zodiacal cycle. As the mutable fire sign, however, it represents a combination of passion and mobility, and so has come to symbolize the fervent urge to transcend the barriers of convention, to move outwards and onwards in the search for wisdom and truth. Its glyph expresses this perfectly, the arrow directed to the heavens, symbolizing the power of man's aspirations and the deadly earnestness of his quest. Ptolemy designated Sagittarius a bicorporeal sign, or two-bodied. That doesn't make an appearance in your English translation here, but it certainly will in the Greek, by the way. A concept that had mythological expression in the centaur, half man, half horse, a symbol of the warfare between the spiritual and carnal aspects of the individual person. These weird creatures were almost always considered to be savage, with the exception of Aesculapius' teacher, Chiron, who was renowned for his kindness and wisdom, who gave his life to save Prometheus, and who represents the eventual triumph of the human over the bestial. This will actually be obvious, even in the English. Now, let's get to our star map and follow the track of the sun as it works its way through the sky every year. Here we have Sagittarius itself. The two deacons, constellations traditionally associated with this particular sign, are Ara, way down here, the altar in Latin, the curse in Greek. Both senses are used. In fact, Mark goes through a lot of trouble to link them together in a very Markan manner. And then we have Draco, the dragon at the very top of the sky. He doesn't make an appearance in Mark. I suspect he actually shows up much later in the Gospel of John, however, just not as a dragon. Sagittarius, as you probably know, is a half-man, half-horse archer. Being one part human and another part animal, he is a fine exemplar of mankind in general. Placed on this isthmus of a middle state, a being darkly wise and rudely great, He hangs between, in doubt to act or rest, in doubt to deem himself a god or beast, in doubt his mind or body prefer. Born but to die, and reasoning but to err. Chaos of thought and passion, all confused, still by himself abused or disabused. Created half to rise and half to fall, great Lord of all things, yet a prey to all. Sole judge of truth, in endless error hurled, the glory, jest, and riddle of the world. Now, let's read our Bible. When they were approaching Jerusalem, at Bethphage and Bethany, near the Mount of Olives, he sent 2 of his disciples and said to them, so right off the bat we have our 2 bodies. Go into the village ahead of you, and immediately as you enter it, you will find tied there a colt that has never been ridden. Untie it and bring it. If anyone says to you, why are you doing this? Just say this, the Lord needs it and will send it back here immediately. They went away and found a colt tied to it near a door, outside in the street. As they were untying it, some of the bystanders said to them, what are you doing untying the colt? They told them what Jesus had said, and they allowed them to take it. Now, street is the Greek amphodu. That's the amphi, just like an amphibian. 2 lives, 2 bodies, literally. On the one hand, one for the sea, one for the land. 2 men are going to 2 streets, meeting in a quarter, probably surrounding a block of houses. And notice, as I said in my previous video on Scorpio, which I link below, we suddenly start speaking in coded language, and people marked do not name start to show up. So the resurrection of Lazarus has the exact same consequences in the Gospel of Mark as it does in John's Gospel. Things have suddenly become very dangerous for Jesus and his followers, specifically these particular followers who are part of Lazarus' community. Everyone there is unnamed in this early Gospel. By the end of the video, when we look at the evidence scholars use to try and figure out the relative dates of these Gospels, you see there are people who are named in Mark and not in the other Gospels, but they're different people and they're named for different reasons. Let's look at the same parallel in Matthew. As you can see, there's no mention of a street at all, but there's both a donkey and a colt, and he rides them both somehow. Not really. This is just an example of Matthew's strange doubles. Not so strange anymore. There are also examples in 8:28 through 34. The 2 demoniacs are healed. 9:27 through 31. 2 blind men. 20:29 through 34. 2 more blind men. You know what comes after this? This. You're looking at it. So, what's going on? You're looking at 2 examples of Greco-Roman biography in action. There's only one demoniac, and there's a single blind man in each case, and Jesus just rides a colt. But Matthew changes these details because he's sending you a message. In this case, we are blind, our personalities are splintered, and the world is infested with demons. So this is his spin on Mark's Sagittarius section. And as you see, he wove it in a thread throughout his text. Now Luke's spin will be a lot more elaborate. He will launch a whole network of verses in his Sagittarius section. Now this kind of switching up of details is perfectly acceptable under the rules of Greco-Roman biography. It's like using lumber to build a house. It can go up here, over here, or this way or that way. Obviously there are limits, you just can't make things up. Now this is why taken together, these 4 Gospels are without peer in the Roman Empire. Each evangelist is allowed the free play necessary to write a good biography, but because we have 3 synoptic Gospels and a 4th Gospel coming in, the Gospel of John, we can triangulate them and get down to the nitty-gritty on some of the more mundane details. Now Mark also changed a detail to send a message of his own. He says they found the colt at a street corner at Amphodu. Now how can I be sure he changed that detail? Say about 80%. Because like Matthew, Luke doesn't mention a street either, much less a street corner. John doesn't give us any details at all on how Jesus found his colt, and all the coded language disappears, because now he can bring in Lazarus. When the great crowd of the Jews learned that he was there, they came not only because of Jesus, but also to see Lazarus, whom he'd raised from the dead. So the chief priests planned to put Lazarus to death as well, since it was on the account of him that many of the Jews were deserting and were believing in Jesus. Now, I told you the sudden secrecy in Mark comes right after the so-called secret Mark in the Scorpio video. And now John is telling you why. And he can tell you that because he wrote this decades after Jerusalem had been destroyed by the Romans and broken the power of the priests, the Sadducees, and the Pharisees. They didn't end up killing Lazarus because he was too well known and his family was too powerful. The secrecy was probably a condition imposed on the early church instead. The next day, the great crowd that had come to the festival heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem. So they took branches of palm trees and went out to meet him, shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord, the King of Israel." Jesus found a colt and sat on it. All right, so the whole question of how he found the colt again is completely ignored. It's no longer important. The whole narrative was used to demonstrate that they were keeping secrets. But the cat's out of the bag now. So they're calling out, "Hosanna, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord, the King of Israel. As it is written, 'Do not be afraid, daughter of Zion. Look, your king is coming, sitting on a donkey's colt.'" This is Mark's version, basically the same. Then they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks on it, and he sat on it. Many people spread their cloaks on the road, and others spread leafy branches that they had cut in the fields. Then those who went ahead and those who followed were shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. Hosanna in the highest heaven." This whole scene is explicitly Sagittarian. It also fits with my theory that the Gospel of Mark is bringing in the organizational theme of the cult of Mithras. There, the central mythology is the tauroctony, the slaying of the bull, representing human passion. Later, they eat the bull while reclining on its skin, and therefore integrating it. Now here, Jesus is riding a colt that's never been ridden before. Therefore, it should be fighting him, and yet it is not. Therefore, Jesus is the very image of the full master of the Mithraic mysteries. But it isn't supposed to happen until after the bull is slain, and after he's been eaten, and yet nothing has died, and nothing's been consumed. Yet, Jesus has prevented the death of Lazarus in the Scorpio section, and we're not going to have our Last Supper until right before he was crucified. Therefore, even though none of this has happened, Jesus is still, nevertheless, the very image of a full master of the Mithraic mysteries. Therefore, whoever Jesus is and wherever he's from, he does not need those mysteries. This is why in Matthew and Luke, the centurion, who stands in for the school of Mithras, acknowledges Jesus as the Lord and Master of death and illness, and therefore his Lord and Master. Now, as I've said in other videos, the mystery schools are basically schools of psychology, and Jesus had a very warm and mutually respectful relationship with members of the cult of Mithras. Therefore, Jesus does not have a problem with therapy and therapist, as long as everybody knows their place. Now remember, Sagittarius, and this is the Sagittarius section, is a centaur, and with a single exception, centaurs are wild and untamed. That exception is Chiron, who lays down his life for Prometheus, just as Jesus will lay down his life for us. Now let's look at our next section in Mark. I've got the middle part shaded out because this is an example of what is called the Mark and sandwich technique. It's unique to Mark, and it's a trait of his that was only formally recognized in the 1970s. It's exactly what you think, a main story bracketed by a secondary story, just as the meat and veg is surrounded by the bread. The secondary story is used to highlight the primary story. On the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree and leaf, he went to see whether perhaps he can find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. He said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard it. In the morning, as they passed by, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. Then Peter remembered and said to him, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed is withered." I used to think that was cruel. This is not the season for figs. Nevertheless, the tree promised figs and did not deliver. We're about to find something else that also promises to satisfy a hunger, and it doesn't deliver either. And it's going to be cursed. And here we have our first and only explicitly utilized deacon of Sagittarius, the curse, Ara. But it also means something else. And when we get to the meat and the veg, we're going to see it there. Mark is a very clever man. Now, Luke does not have a version of this story. Matthew does. So let's look at that. In the morning, when he returned to the city, he was hungry. And seeing a fig tree by the side of the road, he went to it and found nothing at all on it but leaves. Then he said to it, "May no fruit ever come from you again." And the fig tree withered at once. When the disciples saw it, they were amazed, saying, "How did the fig tree wither at once?" Here, the tree withers instantly, which is right. Well, Mark likes his sandwich technique, and Matthew likes to condense his stories. So either could be right. There's no mention of the tree being out of season, because Matthew doesn't attach it to the temple, which is also out of season, because Jesus, who is the true temple and priest and sacrifice all rolled into one, hasn't been sacrificed yet. And now we move to the meat and veg, where we see Ara again, and I also think Draco. Then they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves, and he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He was teaching and saying, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations'? But you have made it a den of robbers." And when the chief priests and the scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him, for they were afraid of him, because the whole crowd was spellbound by his teachings. And when evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city. Well, right off the bat, we have our second meaning, Ara, the altar. In Latin, it's cursed in Greek. In this case, it's the altar in the temple. So Mark used his sandwich technique to sweep up both meanings of the deacon to kill two birds with one stone. Both the tree and the temple made promises they reneged on. Jesus curses them both. What happened to the tree? It died. What will happen to the temple? It will die. So, the prophecy explicitly made in Matthew and Luke, and later here in Mark, is tucked away very nicely into our Sagittarius section, where we find Ara. I also think Draco is tucked away in here too, just not as a dragon. Now think about it. Jesus drove out the money changers. With what? His hands? No. I think he used a horsewhip. And that's what Sagittarius is holding over his head. If Draco is a whip and its head is the whip's handle, then it's positioned right over Sagittarius's head and most importantly his hands, which would wield it. His rear end faces Capricorn. But there's no whip in Mark, and there's no whip in Matthew and Luke either. So where does the whip come from? You always see it in paintings of Jesus driving out the money changers. It's in the Gospel of John. I think he noticed the gap and filled it. The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. Making a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. He told those who were selling the doves, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my father's house a marketplace." It's also in Manilius's poem on Sagittarius. He lived at the same time Jesus did. The double centaur different tempers breeds. They break the horse and tame the fiery steeds. They love the sounding whip, the race, the rein, and whirl the chariot o'er the dusty plain. Nor is their humor to the fields confined. They range the woods and team the savage kind. For in the frame, in double forms expressed, the man is uppermost and rules the beast. His bow full drawn implies, his rays impart strength to the limbs and vigor to the heart. Quick active motions, full of warmth and heat, still pressing on, unknowing to retreat, just like Jesus in the temple. This kind of energy is exactly what Jesus needed to drive those little monsters out of it. Now we're going to look at the final verses from Sagittarius, and we're going to pay special attention to the Greek because Mark specifically selected his words with Sagittarius in mind. But we're also going to get a glimpse of the underlying spirit and intention of something from the Gospel of Luke that I've treated in several of my videos. It's a very old saying of Jesus that I've come to call the gay rapture. But first, let's get to Mark. It actually goes through verse 25. Verse 26 might show up in earlier translations, but there's almost unanimous agreement that it was probably slipped in centuries later. Therefore, it's left out. Jesus answered them, "Have faith in God. Truly I tell you, if you say to this mountain, 'Be taken up and thrown into the sea,' and if you do not doubt in your heart, but believe that what you say will come to pass, it will be done for you." Now, doubt is diakrithē, which literally means a split decision. We're going to look at another translation that actually conveys this meaning better. When you do not have a split between two decisions, just like when you no longer have a split between your animal body and your divine mind, you can do this. So I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. This next part is important. Whenever you stand praying, forgive, if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father in heaven may also forgive you your trespasses. If you do not forgive, then you will not be forgiven. It's not complicated. We're all in this screwed up situation together. Now, before we move on, I happen to have started working on my Capricorn video, and notice that Mark keeps playing around with that krithē in diakrithē. 12:15, hypocrisin, which is not accurately translated as a hypocrite, someone who says one thing and does another. It's a legalistic nitpicker, someone who strains out gnats and swallows camels, literally an underjudger. And 1240, perisoteron crima. These people steal from widows and say solemn public prayers. They shall receive excessive judgment. Now let's look at the translation of Dr. Nyland. She captures everything perfectly. Have faith in God, Jesus answered. Whoever says to this mountain, be snatched up and thrown into the sea, and not undecided, but believes that what they say is happening, will have what they want. So the mountain is snatched up. There's vigor, energy, decision. And that decision is not split. It is for this reason that I tell you, when you pray and ask for all things you want, believe that you have already taken hold of them, and they're yours. He continued, whenever you're in a state of praying, if you've got anything against anyone, forgive them, so that your Father in heaven can forgive you your mistakes. Now also when we talk about trespasses, that's a loaded term with us English-speaking Christians. It comes with baggage. We don't get a solid grip on what Jesus is actually saying here. Dr. Nyland gets rid of that baggage for us. The Greek word is proptomata, our mistakes, even our blunders. That's why you have to be forgiving. All of our lives are going to be full of blunders. Now I want to talk about this energy of being snatched up, unsplit. That's a spirit and an energy that's true to the Greek and yet utterly lacking in our standard translations. This is important because, as you know, most scholars think Mark is very early. As is our cue, our collection of sayings from Jesus. You can pause and read this if you want, but I'm jumping right in. Zeus and Ganymede, boom, like lightning. Ganymede's hound was so traumatized he howled at the sky for hours after Zeus had taken Ganymede. And we live in a world split between the higher and the lower, jammed together chaotically. Gods descending and mating with women and producing mighty men. Gangs of men trying to rape angels. Then you have gay couples. As I said in my video on Scorpio, while heterosexual couples represent the union of the conscious ego with the personal unconscious, gay couples represent the union of the conscious ego with the higher self. This union is represented, of course, by sexual union between these same-sex couples. But whereas now it is an imprecise and unwholesome union, when Jesus comes back, it will be full and complete. Luke does not have the story of the cursed fig tree, and he doesn't have the mountain either, but he has this. The apostles said to the Lord, increase our faith. The Lord replied, if you had faith the size of a mustard seed, you could say to this mulberry tree, be uprooted and planted in the sea, and it would obey you. So I moved this particular saying from the dramatic, from the snatching to the ridiculous. You're going to plant a mulberry tree in the sea? This snatching, the grabbing, it's still there. He just moved it out of this verse. And by the way, Mark talks about the tree withered to its root. Matthew does not. Luke brings the roots back in. So he's looking at Mark. So back to our snatching and grabbing. The gay rapture, it's in red. This slide is from my Scorpio video. It has two stories that connect the rapture back to a gay couple, the centurion and his boy, Luke 7, 1 through 10, which is what men called their lovers, whether they spoke Latin or Greek, and they weren't little boys either. Some of them were bigger and stronger than they were, and they had beards. The citation from Luke 22, 56 through 57, cited at the top, clears that up for us. Here's our mulberry tree, going right into it. So there's no doubt the gay rapture is Luke's reworking of the mountain saying from Mark. Oh, and I forgot to add this from my Scorpio video. Right after the centurion and his boy in Luke, we have the resurrection story of the widow of Nain who is burying her son, her only son. In my last video, I showed that this was either Luke slipping in a disguised secret Mark or using secret Mark to change the details of a separate resurrection story. Secret Mark, of course, being where Jesus marries Lazarus, and they have their wedding night. This map of Luke's tightly choreographed network of stories is getting super crowded, don't you think? Now, on a hunch, I decided to look on Wikipedia to see if there's anything about a mulberry tree that would help explain Luke's choice. And there is. The story of Pyramus and Thisbe, the ancient world's version of Romeo and Juliet. Here we see them on the floor of a villa in Cyprus. The mulberry tree took on the color of their shed blood, according to a tale told by Ovid, who was already famous all over the Roman world by the time of Jesus' ministry. And this is one of his most famous stories, so Luke would have known about it. But here you don't see a mulberry tree, because in the original telling, Pyramus was turned into a river and Thisbe was turned into a spring, which is what you see here instead. So, with Luke, you have a mulberry tree growing in a body of water, therefore ably compressing both versions into a single verse. So now I'm no longer baffled by his use of a pagan story of Zeus and Ganymede. He's using one right before then. Oh, but there's more, because something weird is going on with the stars around Sagittarius. There's a child being kidnapped by an eagle, Aquila, and Aquila is the eagle who carried Zeus's lightning bolts, just exactly like the lightning and the eagles we see in our gay rapture narrative. This is weird because this child becomes Antinous almost exactly 100 years after Jesus' ministry. He is officially recognized as such by the Emperor Hadrian to commemorate his male lover, Antinous, who had mysteriously disappeared, just like one of the men in the gay couples in our gay rapture. And Antinous was a Bithynian, which is right next door to Phrygia, to the north. It's in Turkey, modern-day Turkey. That's where Ganymede is from. The modern astronomical community got rid of Antinous and folded him back into Aquila in 1930. So, what's going on? The best explanation is a lot of people thought that this was Ganymede when Luke wrote his gospel. Thus it would make sense that Hadrian renamed him Antinous. But even if I'm wrong, Zeus's eagle is in Sagittarius, and in Luke's version of Sagittarius, Zeus's eagle shows up in his gay rapture. There's no way I'm getting this wrong. There's no way I'm reading into this. There's no way this is an accident. Not in a billion years. You know how we find black holes? We find all the stuff spinning around them. That's exactly what we have going on here with Jesus' marriage. Everything is spinning around it. Lots and lots of things. And now, I will end with my two meta comments. The first will be about the relative dating of the Gospel of Mark. And all I did for this, and this is going to be real quick, is I went to the Wikipedia article and I picked through all the points contested by both sides. And this is how I think Reverend Darlison's work can answer some of those questions. Most scholars think the Gospel of Mark was written first. Matthew and Luke drew from Mark, and they also drew in a Q source, just a collection of sayings. Quella is the German that it's short for. I think that Matthew and Luke are somehow communicating with each other. I'm not sure about it. These are the three reasons as to why people look at things like that. We have our double tradition, minor agreements, and then we have order. Double tradition. Some 200 verses shared by Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. That would be Q. Minor agreements. Matthew and Luke parallel Mark, but agree against Mark in minor differences. That's, to me, evidence of collaboration. Order. Matthew frequently agrees with Mark against Luke. Luke frequently agrees with Mark against Matthew. Luke and Matthew rarely agree against Mark. Or to flip it, Mark nearly always follows Matthew and Luke when they agree, and one or the other when they don't. On the other hand, the double traditions shared by Matthew and Luke share no order. Mark is in the middle of Matthew and Luke, so realistically it could either be a source for both or it could have used both as a source. So this is one of those things that was considered slam dunk? Not really. What I think about this. Mark follows the zodiac, so in this area he's not influenced by either of the Gospels. But why would Matthew and or Luke follow the zodiac in some places but not in others? This tells me Mark was at least organized first, although it might have been written and or released later. The lack of order in the double tradition and their Q resources tells me that without Mark, there would have probably been very little agreement of order, if any at all. Burnett Hillman Streeter thinks the minor agreements are simply a matter of later harmonization between Matthew and Luke. There's plenty of evidence of that, so until we can really nail down the actual wording of these texts, a lot of these challenges may never be answered. So either they're harmonized as of the time they're writing, which I think, or they're harmonized later. That's why we had the minor agreements. I must say, I did not even know about the minor agreements. All this time I've been doing these videos, I might have read about it, but just completely forgot about it. Another possibility, because Mark is too raw with this marriage of Jesus, Matthew, as I've said several times in my videos, Matthew runs away from the gay, and that's what he did. And then later, another possibility is Luke steps in, sees that this needs to be brought in, does it more discreetly, and he harmonizes with Matthew personally. Mark and style. It's full of Latinisms and idiom and vocabulary. This supports my connection with the cult of Mithras, which is largely Western. This is also more colloquial, his language, etc. This would make sense if Mark is talking to rank-and-file Roman soldiers. Content found only in Mark. Only 4 pericopes, stories, but a quarter of his verses were trimmed away because they were deemed non-essential. He tended to be verbose. But if he got these stories from Matthew and Luke, then scholars think he would have had to use an independent source, probably Peter, and woven that material into his stories throughout the gospel, which seems messy. But the more likely explanation is, for the extra worth, is he's connecting the actions of Jesus to the zodiac. Now, the example that I saw in Wikipedia was the time when he's on the Sea of Galilee. Okay, he certainly is there. He's with several ships. Well, that's the Gemini section. They're the deities that presided over sailors and ships. So by that reckoning, he could in fact have written his gospel last. What I think about this, as I said, Luke knows Mark, but not Secret Mark, or apparently he doesn't. That tells me the Mark we have came before Luke, and Secret Mark was either not written yet, or Luke never got hold of sources who knew it, because it was secret. But that tells me nothing about whether Secret Mark or Matthew was written first. They seem to be sharing resources. Editorial Fatigue. This is an interesting one. Mark Goodacre lists a number of occasions where Matthew and Luke start out changing Mark. Then they go back to Mark's reading. There are no counterexamples. What I think about this, while somebody gave an explanation for one of the examples in the Wikipedia article, the fact that there are apparently several such occasions puts this case in favor of Mark's priority, although Matthew could be using material that Mark originally got from him. Name of eyewitnesses. They are named in Mark, but not in Matthew and Luke, apparently because they could be used as eyewitnesses at the time of Mark, but not at the time of Matthew and Luke. These are people who would otherwise be left anonymous. This favors Mark in priority, obviously. Mark's secrecy, documented here in Sagittarius, also supports Mark in priority because things, when he was written in the 50s, I think, if not before, things were still very raw. And now for my final reading, The Genesis of Secrecy by Frank Kermode, on the interpretation of narrative. These passages have been especially comforting to me and informative. I hope they will be for you as well. You read books, right? The Bible, perhaps? I hope so. All of these are from his opening lecture, Carnal and Spiritual Senses of a Text, page 4. Our acts of divination, for the acts that determine undetected latent sense are properly so called, our divinations are made necessary by the fact of our occupying, inescapably, a position in history which is not the position of the text we cultivate, and not a position of which we have much objective understanding. Although I think I am bringing more objective understanding to the text. Of course, everybody claims that. Though it helps to constitute the complex of prejudices we bring to the task of discovering a sense for us in the text we value, another element of prejudice. So, I have a prejudice that Jesus not be married to another man. The character of our encounter with ancient texts is accordingly highly problematical, though in that respects it differs only in degree from that of our encounter with any text, because we're not in the mind of the person who wrote the text, and the next day they might not even be in the same mind themselves. These are some of the considerations that preoccupy philosophers of interpretation, and whoever forsakes the manifest carnal sense of the outsider, so whoever gives up on the obvious interpretation of the text, what's the plain reading of the Bible? I wish it were that easy. Okay. Whoever forsakes that and deals with the latent or spiritual must in some measure embroil himself in the problems of that philosophy, which is itself subject to unknowable historical imitation and subject to change. So try as hard as you can to keep the ground beneath your feet solid, but forgive yourself when it isn't. Just do the best you can. It is, of course, true that individual acts of interpretation are rarely, if ever, performed in full consciousness of these meta-interpretive considerations. I am. It's breathing down my neck. And although we are aware how much any interpretation must depend on a tacit form of knowing acquired from institutional training, we tend to reserve our highest praise for those interpretations that seem most intuitive, most theory-free, seeming to proceed from some untrammeled divinatory impulse, having the fortuity of genius. I think that's Reverend Darlison's work on the Zodiac and the Gospel of Mark. And I think a lot of my work too. It's a genius, a bolt of lightning, like Zeus's lightning, like Yahweh's lightning. It's just like boom, and then everything's shaken up and settles into a new place. The possibility of such divinations may explain why Hermes once laid claim to a share in the lyre of Apollo. Apollo's lyre, it's his musical instruments. Hermes, hermeneutics, the study of the spiritual latent sense in text, pulling meaning out of text, hermeneutics from Hermes. We admire their natural violence, or cunning, or horrified by it in my case, or their lyric force. And I admire that in my case. And only latter do we reason about them and see how, in spite of everything, the institution helped to shape them. I hate to interrupt this guy all the time, but I'm very aware of the institution. The church is looking at me while I do this, and Jesus is standing right behind the church, looking at me. The best psychoanalysts are admired by their colleagues not for theoretical mastery or correctness, but for their powers of divination, for the acuteness of their third ear. I'm glad that he's bringing in psychoanalysis. I'm a Jungian, of course. I mean, not trained, formally trained. But, I talk about that a lot in my videos. So that skill seems to be likening. I'm basically doing what I do best. And so that's why I do it, and I do it for the church. I do what I do best, and I do the best I can. And I have to say, it's pretty damn good. That these powers were partly created by, remain under the control of, and derive their high value from, the historical institution of psychoanalysis is a truth that emerges in subsequent discussion. So it is with the interpretation of written texts. The discovery of latent senses may appear to be a spontaneous individual achievement, but it is privileged and constrained by the community of the ear, whether tertiary or circumscribed, privileged or constrained or driven on. Now, the Greek Orthodox Church has the text of Secret Mark. They're free to release it to scholars to evaluate at any time, and scientists. Anytime they want. We're not the one hiding that text. Page 16. At this point, it may be useful to state in summary fashion some of the rules and cautions I hope to have elicited from my exercise on party going. It's the name of a novel that he works with. Very interesting novel. For they ought to be remembered when we approach this rather different set of narratives, sacred writ, the Bible. First, we need some assurance that a book has sufficient value, and what is aught but as 'tis valued, to warrant the kind of attention we are proposing to give it. Well, of course, it's the Bible. A mercantile approach, but Hermes is patron of merchants. More formally, this high valuation is achieved by including the text in a canon, as for example with Mark. That's what he says. Thirdly, there is the moment of interpretation, the discovery or choice of what, after Dilthey, might be called an impression point. One may perceive in a life some moment that gives sense and structure to the whole, and it need not come at the end of life. Dilthey cites the conversion of Augustine, which made sense of the apparently unrelated flux of events on which it supervened. It is a part with a relation to of particular privilege to the whole. A work of art, he believed, would have this same impression point, around which the whole Gestalt must be articulated. The Gestalt is that which is greater than the sum of its part. It's what I talk about here. Everything revolves around that marriage of Jesus and Lazarus. Happy to be wrong. If I am, I'll run away from it. No problem. Ready to drop that ball and run away from it. Skip, skip, skip. Fourthly, this divination must not be left to stand on its own. Indeed, it can only be justified if we contrive to reconcile it with a larger whole. The first need is to reconcile it with the whole of the narrative in which it occurs, the Gospel of Mark. But we may also need to consider it in relation to a whole which is larger still, an oeuvre, a collection of work, normally referred to the total body of work of Aristotle or whatever. We have Mark, we have the Gospels, we have the rest of the New Testament, we have the Old Testament, we have the Epic of Gilgamesh, so we have broader ancient Near Eastern culture. I'm bringing it all in. And I'm making that demand on myself because I do this for the church. We may come upon difficulties. There may be evidence, as I suggested there was with Henry Green, the author of Party Going, that speaks against the probability of such elaborately occult figurations. So, you tend to read into the text and, introverted intuitives like us, we tend to look for readings in the text. This, incidentally, is the sort of consideration often ignored by allegorizers of Shakespeare. While we seek our intimations of latent order, we may omit to notice that our text has a manifest gratuitousness, a playfulness, we might add a blindness, a deafness, a forgetfulness, that tells against our scheme, our heresy, our blasphemy. I say that in a mocking term, but it's serious. It's a problem. I mean, it's fun to do this, but we're talking about the Bible here. We're talking about Scripture. I love this man. He's very kind. Adam Smith, who wrote Wealth of Nations, also a very kind man. Believe it or not, it shows in his book. He's also a moral philosopher. So with that, we bring our video on Sagittarius to an end. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it was helpful to you, as it was to me to make it. God bless, and we'll see you next in Capricorn.